we come to Luke chapter 8, verses 40 through 56. A couple of people we're going to meet along the way. A few other people we're going to meet as well. One of the things that stands out about these particular verses in chapter 8 is that God's timing is not always our timing. We all have experienced that at one time or another. Things happen in our lives which often we go, why is this happening to me? Why now? Or how come it is God doesn't answer me? How come I don't see a response to my fervent prayer? And so Jesus met a lot of different people as he's going about the region. Some needed physical healing, like the demoniac man. Some needed deliverance. Some needed saving. Some needed to learn about God. Jesus was there along the line of every single person and circumstance and situations to minister to these people. So chances are that each of these people that we're going to meet today felt that their issue was the most important issue above everybody else's. And we're going to meet, like I said, some people, excuse me, in this passage who can honestly say, hey, my hurt is more hurtful than your hurt. So we're going to meet the first guy in verses 40 through 42. Jesus returned. Where did he return from? He returned from healing the demoniac man in the Gergesenes region. Remember, those people didn't want Jesus anymore, so they said, go away. Notice in verse 40, when Jesus returned, the people welcomed him, for they had all been waiting for him. They'd been waiting for him. Where did he go? Why isn't he around? Why did he go over there? When's he coming back? And there was a man named Jairus, and he was an official of the synagogue, and he fell at Jesus' feet and began to implore him to come to his house. Now, as soon as Jesus gets back, there is a huge crowd that engulfs him. It'd be much the same way as if I said to you all today, let's all just move so there's no empty seats next to you. Let's just press you in with all the people that are here, and you would begin to get some semblance that no matter which way you turned, it was going to be a difficult way to maneuver. And so this man named Jairus, who was a respected leader in the community, who had heard about Jesus and probably maybe listened to Jesus as he taught in the synagogues. Maybe even he had heard about the dead that Jesus had raised in the city of Nain a few chapters back. But Jairus was just not any ordinary kind of guy. Jairus was the president of the synagogue. He was the one who was responsible for the administration of the synagogue and ordering the public service. He was probably well-to-do, and he would select those who would lead in prayer, read the scripture, and teach and or preach. So, he carried some standing in the community. He fell at the feet of Jesus' feet, it says in verse 41, and began to implore him, beg him, beseech him, urge him, plead with him to come to his house. And why did he do that? Because verse 42, he had an only daughter who was 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. Reminds me of that time I went to Disneyland in 2017. And there were so many people there that day. We only rode one or two rides because the lines were so long. There was no elbow room. There was nowhere to sit. And there was no place to eat because they were taking reservations. And if you didn't have one, you couldn't wait in line and be with all those other people that were already there. It was a madhouse. And we left Disneyland that day and we said, we're never going back. Now, COVID has done a wonderful thing because it's limited the number of people they can let in now. So that made it really nice. I mean, I could walk at some points during the day like this when I was there. But nonetheless, Jairus, I can guarantee you, he didn't know what to do. Jesus probably by this time had been barred from the synagogues, and so Jairus already knew, but he already also knew what God had done through this guy, and my daughter's hurting. I'm desperate. I've got to do something. And it reminds me back in 1986 when Ben was born, Janice and I had very poor insurance, and Ben had been born by cesarean, as Holly was. And so I got my bill in 1986 for Ben, $7,000. We had just bought our house in 1985. We had $1,000 in the bank. And I said to the hospital, can I pay overtime? And they said, sure, you got 90 days. And so I thought, well, okay, I got 90 days. Okay, what am I going to do here? You know, I'm desperate. I went to my bank where I had the $1,000. They said, how much do you want to borrow? I said, I want to borrow $7,000. We can't do that. Why not? Well, we can give you 10% of what you got in your savings account. I said, that's just $100. I mean, I said, if I had this, the amount needed to get the $7,000, like if I had $70,000 in the bank, I wouldn't need to go to the bank to borrow it, right? You know? But they said no. So then I called the bank of Mom. Hi, Mom. Hi. Mom, Ben is in the hospital. The hospital won't release him. I tried to do everything I could to make it appear that Ben was being held hostage as a little baby. And she goes, what do you want? Can I borrow $7,000? She goes, no! I hung up the phone. I thought, what am I going to do? I mean, what am I going to do? And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do. What am I going to do? I got to pay the hospital $7,000. I was pastoring my first church, Westside Community Church in Los Banos, and I thought, there's a rich lady in our church, and I've never done this before, and I've never done it since. So I said to her, her name's Lorene, and I said, Lorene, can I see you after church today? And Lorene goes, sure. So I brought Lorene into my office, and I said, Lorene, can I borrow $7,000? And she goes, well, what do you need $7,000 for? I said, I need $7,000 to get Ben out of the hospital. You know, and they're holding him hostage and everything. It's terrible. And Lorene says, let me think about it. Now, I told you Lorene was wealthy, right? So the next day she calls me up and she says, come over to my house. So I drove over to her house and she hands me papers. She goes, here, take this with you to the First Interstate Bank. They are ready for you, expecting you to come. You know? Oh, so I walk in the door, Reverend Austin. Why, how nice to see you. Come on in and sit down. Oh, this is really cool. Well, you need just $7,000? Do you need more? I want my son out of the hospital, thank you very much. And and I realized Lorene had called him up, and she had paved and greased the way for me to be able to get that loan. And Janice and I, true story, Janice and I, who never had much left over, I mean, you know, it's no secret, pastors are not always paid, you know, a whole lot. So back in those days, it was paid even less. I think my whole package back then was like $22,000 a year. So, you know, and out of that came taxes and insurance and all this kind of stuff. So, there wasn't a whole lot I got every month. But God made it possible for us to save $700 a month for 10 months and pay that whole loan off. Now, I wish I could say that it happened every single month the rest of our married lives, but it only happened for those 10 months. And God supplied all we needed to have it go. And I thought, wow, what a lesson, for all of us, when we get frustrated and we don't know which end is up, to realize that God is already at work on providing the solution that you need. And so here's Jairus, who is probably as frustrated as me, wondering, what in the world am I going to do? My little girl is 12 years old and she's dying, and I need you to come to my house. Like, let's go. Come on. Forget all these other people. They're not as important. My little girl is 12 years old and she's dying. And a woman, in verse 42:3, who had a hemorrhage for 12 years. I think this is really ironic that he's got a 12-year-old daughter and she's got a hemorrhage for 12 years. And could not be healed by anyone. In other words, she had gone to doctors, physicians, you name it. She had gone to wherever she needed to go, and she could not find anyone to heal her. And a lot of things happen to you when you are constantly bleeding. You become very gray looking, you become very tired, you're fatigued. All these things play into it. But keep in mind, you've got all these people pressing in on you, and Jairus is probably saying, come on, let's go. We don't have time to waste here. And this sort of interruption occurs. She came up behind him in verse 44 and touched the fringe of his cloak, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. And Jesus said in verse 45, "Who is the one who touched me?" Now, this is not a question for information. Jesus knew who had touched him. He knew who it was. So he isn't asking because, gee, I don't know who touched me. He knows who touched him. And while they, meaning all the people that were surrounding him in verse 45, were all denying it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing in on you." Like, duh. I mean, you've got all these people who are poking, prodding, all this stuff around you. How in the world can you ask this question? It's interesting that Jesus said, "Someone did indeed touch me, for I was aware that power had gone out of me." Now, we have to understand that this woman with a hemorrhage, like I said, would continue to bleed, would probably turn gray. Her coloring in her face would become gray. She would have lack of strength, and possibly she would be contemplating that this disease that no one can stop will lead to my death. And you have to understand that this is not something that a woman was likely to share with all of her bosom buddies and lifelong friends. I mean, we're not going to share about this kind of malady that's going on. But there were repercussions to this malady that made it very, everybody had to know what was going on with her. For example, she was not allowed to take part in any religious proceedings. She was barred from that because she would be declared in a state of uncleanness, and so therefore she would not be welcomed. Second, she couldn't even go into the temple. She would be barred from the temple because she was declared unclean. She couldn't touch other people. And fourth, she had to be separated from her husband because he would become defiled if he was, touching her in any way, shape, or form. So the woman is really an outcast. We are dealing with someone who, is also very desperate. My problem is worse than your problem. I've been suffering with this for 12 years, and Jairus is saying, yeah, but my little girl's 12 years old, and she's dying, and I need to get him, and do we have to have this interruption now? I could hear Jairus say, she's been bleeding for 12 years as it is. Come on. And Jesus answers that question, says, "Who touched me?" Now, verse 47, when the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, she came trembling and fell down before him and declared in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And Jesus says to her in verse 48, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Now, fringes were things that were normal, either attached to a hem or sleeve or something like that, and you could reach up and you could touch it. And it isn't like she took her finger and went like that. It's like she reached out with her hand and she grabbed it. She grabbed it with such force that she probably pulled it off. You would know that somebody had gotten hold of you and that they were tugging at you, and she was under the misguided thought that if she just touched it, she would be healed. That's misguided. And Jesus corrects her. But notice what he also does. He says to who touched me. Now, he knew who touched him. So again, not a question of seeking information, but to pull this shy woman out of the shadows and bring her forth, because everybody knew what her problem was. And I went through some of the things that she simply could not do. And he calls her out, and she's coming trembling, it says in verse 47. And she fell down, and she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. This was key. The people in the community had to know the power of God had visited them and had to understand that this woman who they had shunned because of all the things that they put upon her had been healed, so that she would be received back, but also that they would realize it wasn't because she reached out and grabbed something. It's because she demonstrated faith. And that's why Jesus says to her, excuse me, in verse 48, your faith has made you well. Not touching me. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. So it was necessary for her cure to be widely known. Her cure must be a matter of public knowledge. And third, she had demonstrated a little bit of superstition in this reaching out and touching the fringe and all this kind of stuff. And Jesus corrected her, but he did it in front of all the people. You don't have to, reach out and do this. You have to have faith. He's going to tell Jairus that as well. And so we have this emergency. The little girl is dying, and in the midst of this emergency, whoops, we've got this woman with a hemorrhage. Now we're done with her, and so in verse 49, while he was telling her, your faith has made you well, go in peace, someone came from the house of the synagogue official, that's Jairus, saying, your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore. Now, just so you know, Jews do not embalm. All right? So the moment you die, everything starts to go, And so even in our 21st century, the Jews still don't embalm, and they bury right away. I have a friend that I knew, his name was Gary, and, I heard he died, and I thought, oh good, I hope they let me know when the, services, I'd like to go and stuff. Well, by the time I found out about it, within 24 hours, Gary had been buried. And I thought, wow, didn't even get a chance to greet his wife or his family, and they just went. And that's because they don't embalm. They don't do that. So what is happening here, don't bother the guy anymore, she's dead, so don't trouble him anymore. And when Jesus heard this in verse 50, he answered him, do not be afraid any longer, only believe, and she will be made well. Only believe. Woman, the faith has saved you. Now, only believe. Only believe. Just believe. That's all he says. So when he came to the house, in verse 51, he did not allow anyone to enter with him, except Peter, John, and James. This is the first time that those three are separated out and asked to come along with him, almost like a private tutoring, if you will, and the girl's father and mother. So you've got 6 people, 7 if you count the little girl, who were all there. And so they were all weeping. And so also what is happening is that the mourners, the professional mourners, have come out to wail and cry and carry on, and they're getting ready to take the little girl out to the cemetery and all these things. They're doing it right away. So they're wailing and they're crying and all these kinds of things. But he said, stop weeping, for she has not died, but is asleep. And they began laughing at him, knowing that she had died. So, you're all this funny, yeah, right, kind of deal. And so they were doing their things. But he, however, in verse 54, took her by the hand and called, saying, child, arise. Look at verse 55. And her spirit returned. I don't know if you have ever noticed this before, or if you've ever said to yourself, if it returned, where did it go? Had to go somewhere. Had to go to some invisible somewhere for him to be able to bring it back, right? She just didn't die and just lay there and put her arms like this and, eyes closed and, everybody looking and going, lifelike. Didn't do that. He calls and he says, come back. And I think, wow, this is so cool because, her spirit returned from that invisible place where it had gone, no matter where that is, I don't particularly know where that is, but it tells me, wow, she went somewhere. She just didn't die and fall over in a dead faint and be a lump and they had to take her somewhere. She actually went somewhere, and Jesus calls her back. And her spirit returned in verse 55, And she got up immediately, and he gave orders for something to be given her to eat. Her parents were amazed. I bet they were. But he instructed them to tell no one what had happened, which is typical, because he didn't want to have his own messiahship revealed too early. Well, what do we see in all this? We see probably a very frustrated Jairus, because the woman with the hemorrhage seemed to be taking priority over me. Hey, my little girl's dying here, kind of deal. And wondering, why are we going through this delay? Why are we going through delay? Jesus' power over disease and death shows, again, his sovereignty over life itself. We see that the story from the conclusion side of it, and not while we're in the middle of it, but if we were in the middle of it, we would be a little frustrated because, you know what, if you wouldn't have spent time with that woman over there and would have gotten to my house, my little girl, wouldn't have been in the situation she was in. So God, why'd you wait? Why'd you put this woman in there? Why do we have to dilly-dally with her? She's been bleeding for 12 years. Why do we have to do that? And oftentimes we ask ourselves the same question. God, how come you're taking so long? How come I don't have an answer? How come somebody else who's only been praying for 3 minutes gets an answer? I've been praying for 30 years. How come I have to wait? Why is that? Well, we often struggle to understand God's timing. Why does God have the time clock that he has? And if anything illustrates to us that he's got everything under control, it's certainly the verses 40 to 56 here. Little girl, verge of death, God says, no problem. Woman with a hemorrhage, hey, come on over. Jesus, let's deal with the woman with the hemorrhage. God says, no problem. We're going to take care of the woman with the hemorrhage, and we're going to take care of the little girl over here as well. I've got everything under control. Everything is just where it needs to be. We must never forget that God is always at work around you. He's always at work around you. He doesn't forget you. His timing is impeccable. But what's interesting in this passage to me is that the life and death situation has to wait for this other situation. When we're focusing on this, because my problem is worse than your problem is, so therefore I need to be moved to the head of the line and all this kind of stuff, the life and death situation waits while the non-life and death situation takes priority. That's just fascinating to me. The woman, is probably thrilled and at being healed, but ultimately, trusting in God's care means accepting his timing for events. Trusting in God's care means accepting his timing for the events. This is a wonderful thing because we can look at our own lives in much the same way. My problems are bigger than your problems. And you're sitting there saying, but my problems are bigger than your problems. And I say to you, God's got them all under control. When we grow frustrated and anxious and nervous and we don't know which end is up and we wonder, what in the world am I going to do? How am I going to get out of this? What do you mean? He's healing the person over there with a broken leg. But God's timing is always perfect. And Jairus could have been very upset. Very happy with the outcome, by the way. But he could have been very upset. Come on! When God said, no, we have to do it this way. So as we lead our lives from day to day, and as we go about and do the things that we need to do, we need to always remember God's always at work. But most importantly, that God's timing is perfect. That we need to rest in him. That we need to say, it is well with my soul. That we need to remember his holiness. That we need to recall all the things that he's done so that we are in the process of growing and trusting him more. Jesus said both times to the woman and to the man, only believe. Keep your focus where it needs to be. Don't lose sight of all that God has done in your life and continues to do. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this opportunity this morning of remembering your timing is perfect. Thank you for Jairus, because boy, Lord, I identify with him. Man alive, do I identify with him. And I'm thinking, come on, let's go, Lord, come on, why are we waiting? Let's do it now. And I also identify with the woman. Wow, God, it's no fun to suffer. It's no fun to go through anguish. It's no fun to go through trials. It's just not fun. And we like to think, God, that you hear our prayers, which you do. And we like to think, God, that you're always at work around us, which you are. And we like to think, God, you're going to answer, and you will. In the midst of all this stuff, the woman showed patience and faith. In the midst of all this, Jairus had to show patience and faith. Lord, that's got to be the hallmark in our life. Patience and faith. And we thank you for it in Jesus' name.